All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the series Viewing Multidimensional Poverty from Many Angles, coming to you from George Washington University in Washington, DC, Oxford University in Oxford, and the United Nations in New York City. I'm James Foster, co-chair of the Elliott School of International Affairs and professor of economics at GW. Joining you today from my sabbatical on a lovely day in London for the 5th episode of this series, which explores the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI, in theory and in practice. Joining me today is Jacob Dirksen of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, who is in Oxford University's Department of International Development located in Queen Elizabeth House, or QEH. Along with colleagues at the Human Development Report Office of the UNDP, we're pleased to offer today's presentation, Methodological Approaches on How to Measure Risk of Poverty with Income and Wealth, presented by 3 researchers at the Luxembourg Income Study, or LIS, Piotr Paradowski, Jörg Neugschwender, and Heba Omar, with discussion by Fanny Kovezdi of OPHI. In just a moment, I'll call on Jacob to provide an introduction to the MPI series and to today's speakers. But first, a quick thanks to IIEP at George Washington, OPHI at Oxford, and HDRO at UN for their continued support of this series. Last week, our good friend Nikolai Supa of Barcelona and OPHI presented a longitudinal perspective of multidimensional poverty in Europe, with comments from another good friend, Philippe van Kern of Luxembourg. Next week in this series, we'll be joined by Putu Nati of FEB Universitas Indonesia and the University of Oxford, who will present multidimensional poverty dynamics in Indonesia in the time of COVID-19, lessons learned and policy implications, with discussion by Dr. Ilan Satriawan of the Vice President's Office in Indonesia. Please join us then, but if you happen to miss an event, you can always find a video on our YouTube channel, IIEPGW. Now over to you, Jacob, for an introduction of the series and today's participants. Jacob.
Thank you very much, James, and good afternoon to everyone here in Oxford, and also good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone online, wherever you're joining us from. Thank you for taking time in your busy schedules to be here with us for an exciting presentation. In this series, what the 3 partnering institutions, IIEP, HDRO, and OPHI try to do is to bring together academics and policymakers who work on multidimensional poverty measurement, including methodological advances, the use of new data, and policy applications. And it's a true delight to have our colleagues from the Luxembourg Income Study joining us today with a presentation that uses multidimensional poverty measurement methodologies on income and wealth data that is uniquely harmonized in the Luxembourg Income Study, of course. And we're really happy that the 3 colleagues who are going to speak in just a minute are joining us for this presentation. We're joined by Piotr Paradowski, who works at the LIS Cross-National Data Center in Luxembourg as a data expert and research associate, and he primarily focuses on the Luxembourg Wealth Study database. Piotr is also affiliated with the Department of Statistics and Econometrics at Gdańsk University of Technology and conducts interdisciplinary research focused on income and wealth distributions and economic inequality, poverty, and welfare state politics. Also online, our second speaker, Jörg Neugschwender, who has a PhD in sociology from the Graduate School of Economic and Social Sciences at the University of Mannheim in Germany. And Jörg is the data team manager at the LIS Cross-National Data Center in Luxembourg, supervising the data team and harmonizing datasets on databases, developing and maintaining data production quality assessment, and also overseeing the consistency of the produced datasets. And last but not least, Heba Omar, who holds a master's degree in biostatistics and demography on the topic of the development of the multidimensional poverty indices from Cairo University, and who's also assistant director of operations at LIS Cross-National Data Center in Luxembourg. So these are our three presenters, and we'll turn over to them in just a second. I also want to introduce my colleague, Fanny Koveshti, who is here with me in Oxford at the department. Fanny is a data analyst with the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, also one of our experts on data sets that are used to construct multidimensional indices. In terms of housekeeping, our three presenters will present their paper for about 30 to 35 minutes, followed by discussion remarks by Fanny, and then we'll open up for questions and answers with the audience both here in Oxford in the room and everyone online. So if you have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A box via Zoom or wave at me here in the room frantically, and we'll be able to bring you into the discussion. Final housekeeping remark, everything is being recorded. So if you do participate in the discussions later on, be mindful that everything you say will also be on the record, as it were. Okay, that's it from me and from us here in Oxford for the time being. Over to our three presenters in Luxembourg.
So again, this is the joint work with Jörg and Heba. Actually, it's ongoing work, not final yet. So we absolutely would like to have your comments and thoughts, what we are doing. Maybe I start right away with the motivation of this research. So we know that all of you who are joining us today in person or online know that basically income is not the only indicator which could define poverty, and income is usually used by official statistics to calculate poverty rate. But this is also not only in the it's mostly in the developed countries, but not necessarily in the developing countries where consumption is used. Of course, we know that income and consumption have been good proxies for assessing poverty and guiding policy actions. We also know that they alone do not constitute the well-being of households. And we know from research in welfare economics that multidimensional character of poverty is most likely much better than only looking at poverty of income or consumption. And actually here on the slide, I have a quotation from François Bourguignon and Charkrati from 2003, when they even say that income as a sole indicator of family well-being is inappropriate and should be supplemented by other attributes and variables. So there's a clear indication here that when we want to talk about poverty, we need to look at more dimensions. And what we are going to show you today is actually three stages of our research. The first stage, we will look at financial assets, and we'd argue that we could add the second dimension or look at two-dimensional poverty, not only from income perspective, but also from wealth perspective. So we know that assets also contribute to the living standards and can be sold out in case of income shortfall or unexpected events. And usually those assets are liquid assets, which can be sold very quickly. But there are also, of course, assets which are real assets, so real estate or car or any belongings, or maybe Rembrandt, which people have in their homes, which could be also sold and maybe used for unexpected events to cover the consumption which is needed. But there is also another thing about wealth that, or having the data on wealth, that we can look at debts of households. And if there are excessive debts, households could be in undesirable economic situations. They cannot pay their debts. They can be in areas. So those two components of assets and debts definitely determine the position of households in this economic realm. So we know also that last 20 years, assets and wealth were incorporated into poverty measure. And we have here on the slides several citations from Hagman and Wolf and Aptizer, Kuipers and Marx and Agdut. And all of them look at poverty in conjunction with assets and also net worth. Well, there is also I think the most influential paper here is Brandolini, Margi, and Smithing from 2010, when they really say that wealth, the role of wealth in definition of poverty is twofold. So it affects well-being for sure, and of course, possession of asset is a major determinant of longer-term prospects of household individuals. So we are going to take you right now to the idea that using Luxembourg Wealth Study database, which is part of Luxembourg Income Study, it's really good idea to construct an index, poverty index, using the information which is in the data. So in LWS data, as we call it, Luxembourg Wealth Study, we have 19 countries, we have 78 data sets over time. And those are countries which were listed here, and the years, there are the data sets which we are aiming to analyze as we go with first the years between 2016 and 2020, the newest data sets, which we'll show you here. And we would like to look at this asset poverty and income poverty, but also as Jörg and Heba will talk about, we will also incorporate other characteristics, household and individual characteristics, which are available in this data. So before I talk to you about asset poverty and income poverty together, I would like to tell you a little bit about methodological remarks. So first of all, we use the relative poverty rate at 50% of the median of the gross household income. We know that usually the poverty is measured by the net income or disposable household income. Unfortunately, many of the data sets which we are using, which contains wealth, they only have gross income. So this is one of the caveats. We use the financial assets only. We don't use the real estate asset or any other non-financial assets to calculate the poverty rates. And we do not utilize pension assets and other long-term savings like life insurance, since they cannot be easily cashed out and used during the hardship times. And of course, we do not tap on bottom code the financial assets, but we equivalize by the household size. So that's one of the methodological remarks. The second one is we would like to tell you how we created the variables which would assign households or individuals into income or asset poor or income poor but not asset poor. So basically what we took, again, we took the relative income poverty line at 50% of the median from, of course, from income, and we see who has financial assets which are below the median times basically 3 times of the monthly median income. And we see if they are below or above this poverty line. So if people who don't have enough assets to cover the consumption of at least 3 months and they are below the income poverty line, they would be called income and asset poor. And if they have assets above the value which would cover the consumption for at least 3 months, they are not asset poor, but they might be income poor. And also another group, the third group is, which we look at, is not income poor and asset poor. And those are people who do not have sufficient financial assets to cover consumption for at least 3 months. But they are actually not belonging to the group of income poor. So this is our three categorization. And then briefly, I'm going to show you how poverty would look like if we combine those things together. So this is the ranking of the countries. And let's start maybe from the middle graph, the income poor. So you have in the middle graph, you have blue bars. And those are the people in the country which are in the countries here from Austria to Estonia, which are ranked by the rate of poverty measured only by income. Now, if you look at the upper part of the slide on the graph on the top, you see the blue bar right there is a income poor and asset poor, and the gray bar is actually people who are income poor but not asset poor, which really nicely shows that those people who are income poor might not necessarily be always asset poor. And if we measure in this way the poverty rates will be lower than we would only measure this with the income variable. So those are actually the protected poor households, because even if they are income poor, they could maybe sell their financial assets and have a good well-being. Then if you look at the bottom of the slide, there are bars which are blue and orange. And actually the blue bars, those are the income poor. And the orange bars are those who are economically vulnerable, those who are assets poor but not income poor. So we actually stack those people together. If you look at this, the country ranking changes, and actually it looks really bad, because if you look maybe at Greece or Estonia or even United States or Slovenia, those people would have actually more than 50% of the population, which would be in some kind of risk to become poor. And this is actually the group which we would like to focus on, specifically Jörg would like to focus on. We would like to know who are those people right there who might have good income but are really asset poor, and why this is really important for us to create later on the multidimensional index. You will hear more from Jörg and Heba, and I will come back to you in a moment at the end with some conclusions and also with a last slide about regression. So now I give my voice right now, the floor to Jörg. Thank you.
So yeah, as Piotr was already mentioning, basically, so we have indeed structured this work into really three parts, and my section right now, which I'm going to present, is basically focuses mostly on the idea that now we will go beyond the idea of the two-dimensional approach of truly only measuring income poverty and asset poverty. Well, although this is a very illustrative way of showing basically how countries compare, it left many questions unanswered for us basically. So how come that 50 to 70% of the population are basically considered poor in those two dimensions? So we think we need to better understand the circumstances which drive basically this situation, so that we gradually can unravel the puzzle and better understand where policy action might basically be necessary to possibly see the underlying mechanisms why we claim that there are some vulnerable groups inside of this larger group that might need a better protection, or let's say basically policies that might strengthen basically their position. And well, mostly what we could think of at this stage was sort of the idea basically, okay, by training people in financial literacy, that they diversify the portfolio, and a couple of things like that. But as we said, we are really at the very early beginning. We are just building together a little bit the tools at this stage, and gradually later on we are thinking more of clarifying all those questions. So let me start from this basically. So in the end, well, who is actually vulnerable? That's our main question in this section right now, basically. So when they don't have financially financial asset, who might be basically the ones that might be immediately at risk. And we were thinking for most about the over-indebted people, but on the other hand, you could also think about other groups. So basically that the ones that have very high housing expenses costs might be at risk, then those with high debt to asset ratio or high debt to income ratio. I will show in a second basically what how these ratios are defined. Then homeowners as a group, indeed, they could be also at risk basically when they are paying off the mortgage. Then employment we are trying to bring in now in this overview, which basically means, well, if you are not employed basically, well, then you should have some financial assets to survive. Then self-employed, yeah, maybe their employment is not as stable as it is with dependent employment. Then the ones with low net wealth, then fixed-term employees. What about those? What about tenants? What about homeowners without mortgage? Could they still be at risk? Those with low income, and then also the debt burden, so the down payments on the mortgage. Maybe we want to look also the low-paid jobs, the ones with low working hours. Could they be more at risk? Other employees could be also at risk. So what we had in mind basically is let's clearly look a little bit more into the characteristics of the financially asset poor. So which indeed Piotr has shown you, basically there's a large proportion of the population which don't own basically the 3 months financial assets to survive with the needed income. And so in the following, we will show you some ideas basically how this group is composed basically. So I will show you a series of charts which pretty much have the same shape. Basically, I will just replace the orange bar with characteristics of the specific group of the financially asset poor. So at the bottom, you will always find the proportion of the income poor. And then I will give you now an example where I replaced the orange bar with some characteristics. And the most straightforward, and so as a reminder, I put on the left-hand side also the legend for that orange bar. So keep in mind basically that it's just about replacing. So here, so in which income quintile or quartile do the financially asset poor are they in the data? So what is shown basically, well, income definition, obviously a large fraction is already by definition in the blue bars. But since the first quartile has 25%, not all the countries have 25% of poverty rate. So there's other persons of the first quartile which are also financially asset poor, but not income poor. And then what you can see is basically, well, the bottom second quintile is reflected a lot in the asset poor group. But on the other hand, you see also basically that there are quite many with high incomes represented also among the financially asset poor. And this might point a little bit basically that they might have indeed some in the background, some savings indeed that they immediately put into something else. And the most straightforward, but it's not a secret basically, is basically they are putting that into the home, they are down paying the mortgage, and that's pretty much one of the main mechanisms that's at work. Obviously, you could also replace the orange bar with the wealth quartiles, and well, not surprisingly, the situation is quite similar. Indeed, there is a more concentration of the financially asset poor among the bottom two quartiles, but also even the higher net wealth income quartiles. You can see that there's a large fraction basically that only well, they have non-financial assets. There's not a lot of portfolio diversification going on. So in the end, well, if they would basically, for example, lose their job and they might basically be already in a position basically where that drop of income might put them into trouble, basically down paying mortgage and what so forth. So let's look basically, first of all, basically, are they mostly homeowners? Are they mostly tenants? Well, not surprisingly, indeed, both groups are presented. There's even in the post-communist countries a large fraction that entirely owns their home, basically, as, for example, Slovakia, Estonia, Slovenia. And even in those countries, basically, it's very uncommon that they possess a lot of financial assets instead. So they are putting the money elsewhere, or they simply don't have the money to put into the saving accounts. Indeed, that's what we found that quite interesting to see. So then, well, in terms of home ownership, we were thinking of calculating mostly a debt to income ratio, and the debt to income ratio refers here to the sum of all debts divided by the total yearly gross income. Also for illustration, we have then grouped the ratio into 4 broad categories, which basically, where the ratio below 1 would indicate that the total debt is lower than the annual income. The ratio above 3, on the other hand, indicates basically that there's a long down payment needed to pay off the debt, and that makes them in a way more vulnerable to a financial market crisis. And the fixed interest rates and down payment might be a key basically to not put them into a risk structure, basically that they all of a sudden have to pay much higher installment because increased level of interest rates. That becomes now, with the current crisis, indeed quite relevant. So we are curious to see what the next wave of data might bring. Indeed, here as a new experience detail. So it does happen indeed that people have a lot of debt basically, so they may take a long time basically to don't pay their debt basically. Well, unless they have a lot of savings indeed, that we don't check here basically. As we said, indeed, it's only one-dimensional in a way, and so the multidimensional will bring a lot of new perspective to this picture. Well, an indicator that is quite close to that, that we also have shown here now is that debt to asset ratio. So basically, how much debt compared to assets do you have? So if that ratio is above 1, basically it even means that you're over indebted and that your debt is larger than your total assets. So in that situation, indeed, it's very difficult in hardship when you face a drop in income to or sell your assets basically, because simply it wouldn't cash in as nicely indeed, and you would even have more troubles basically paying the additional loans that you have to take up. So on the other hand, there's a ratio, well, that sort of goes, if the ratio goes down, it in the end will show you basically that you have well, net wealth. But even that net wealth basically, well, imagine, well, consider that you are now in the group of the financially asset poor basically. So they well, if they have face a drop in income, still that means basically, well, right away they would need to sell something or get some money from the network, have large support from the unemployment system, for example, basically, which could well, make them survive those 3 months basically. So that might be more the question basically, well, do we have already some policies that circumvent that vulnerability indeed? So does this happen in the countries that there's a ratio above 1? Yes, it does. We have not really understood fully the country-specific patterns, and Norway is a little bit of a puzzle to us, why it is showing up that high in it. On the other hand, for the US, basically, while we are suspecting a little bit that might be indeed because of the credit card system, basically, where you pay basically everything on credit card, and in the end, all of a sudden, you basically accumulate a lot of credit indeed. So it's hard to have the overview of all the credit cards that you possess, basically. One thing that I would like to mention also, that the group of the 0.8 to 1 is also a little bit of a concern to us, basically, because if you need to sell some assets quickly, it may mean basically that you cannot sell that basically to the market value that well, these goods are actually worth, basically, because you have to accept basically, okay, you are really in need of that money to accept much lower price. So in the end, basically, that group might be left also with very low positive amount of net worth afterwards. Yes, so but what we wanted to bring in indeed is the idea of the employment status, how this might relate to the whole vulnerability indeed. Obviously, basically, well, you have persons, and I should have mentioned that from the beginning, basically. Now, because of the labor market dimension, we are restricting our analysis to the working age group. That to better understand basically what you see here. So the not employed, basically, those could be simply non-working spouses in data that count on one stable income in the family, basically. Obviously that puts them a little bit more in the vulnerability as against the ones basically that are where both partners would be in employment in data. So that's and Greece is here very illustrative in two ways, basically. So first of all, because indeed there's not so many non-working spouses in it, they have a lower female participation in the labor market. But on the other hand, they have also, well, a lot of informal employment in the self-employment, a lot of agricultural jobs, etc., which might not be as secure, basically, as well, other employment types in data. So in the end, building the indicator, we have looked a little bit into the idea, basically, well, let's put into the dimension the self-employed and fixed term employees into as a risk group, basically. Well, you can also look at employment from a different perspective, which is the work intensity. So here now we have, well, a little bit arbitrarily chosen the thresholds, basically, just to illustrate this, basically. So in the financially asset poor group, basically, there's also, again, of course, a large proportion, basically, that doesn't have any labor income. But on the other hand, also a fraction of the people, basically, which have very low labor incomes, or below the median, or let's say low working hours, basically. And these are, in a way, less stable incomes in the households. And so that's pretty much what we wanted to say about the breakdown of the group as a better understanding of financially asset poor. And that helped us indeed quite a bit, because what came out of this whole exercise was sort of a better understanding which of the indicators could better basically restrict the idea of, well, who's really most at risk, who's more vulnerable than somebody else. And Heba will talk in a second about this in the index. But let me quickly summarize here. So, well, the high income group is also very much included in the financially asset poor. The wealth quartiles are included in the financially asset poor. Some of the people have indeed very high expense or loan burden. So for the homeowners, that's mostly mortgage and other loans. For the tenants, that's more really the combination of actual rent and utilities and possibly some other loans. Well, combined with a low household income indeed, typically. And in the end, yeah, some of the financially asset poor are more at risk losing the job or lower job security. So in the end, basically, well, we have aimed to now build the methodology which accounts for these differences and which still allows us to sort of group vulnerability into some profiles. And the methodology should be really cross-nationally informative at the same time, so widely available. And this is what we have been following, mostly building that index. But now, indeed, I let the floor for Heba to conclude with the index indeed.
We have seen together where we started this whole idea and this whole presentation. So our starting point was we wanted to go beyond income, but due to lots of literature that says income alone cannot be the sole measure, the sole measure of poverty. So we wanted to take advantage of the Luxembourg Wealth Study database. As Piotr has shown you, we have a very rich database that has lots of income variables, wealth variables. So that was our second step or motivation, is to include not only income, but we add up wealth. And the third motivation, as Jörg has shown you, when we looked at this vulnerable group who are financially asset poor but not income poor, we were able to disentangle them by different characteristics, among which was the labor market attachment variables, for which we saw that employment is really important, or labor market attachment generally are really important in assessing individual well-being in the society. So now we were thinking of how to measure our index, which is our economic, what we call economic well-being deprivation index from multidimensional perspective. So since the capability approach and all the work starting on multidimensional poverty and well-being indices, whether to be a human development index or human poverty index, so on and so forth, there has been a very successful methodology upon which the global multidimensional poverty index was generated upon Alcaire and Foster method, and that the global MBI represented the first indicator or index that looked at the direct deprivation in for a whole bunch of developing countries. So it was done on comparable basis. I know the data sets were different, but eventually we had one indicator, one index for a lot of countries. So this really inspired us to use the same methodology of Alcaire and Foster, and taking into account the operationality it offers in order to come up with our index that incorporates income, wealth in terms of assets and debts, in addition to labor market attachment variables. So while the MBI, the global MBI indicators was initially developed to be run on developing countries, our index, on the other hand, will focus or is more applicable in developed countries. And this is very natural at this stage because the information on wealth variables, which Jörg and Piotr talked a lot about, is more existing, or these kinds of surveys generally existing more in developed countries. So in order to generate our index, we have followed the global MBI structure in terms of the aggregation method, usage of equal weights, and the cutoff point at 33%. So another note, while the global MPI was at the is at the household level, our index is at the individual level, rather than only at the household level, and this is taking advantage again of the Alcaire and Foster technique. So we are going beyond household indicators to individual ones. And as we saw together, the labor market attachment variables are of such importance that we would like to include them, and hence we focused on our the work age, the core work age group from 25 to 59. So this index is generated or computed at the individual level, and for the age group 25 to 59, with some deviations that we will see together. So let's go inside our index and start with the dimensions. The first dimension is income and expenses. An individual is considered deprived if he or she living in a household where First indicator, the household income is below 50% of the equivalized household median income. Second indicator, if the ratio of debt burden, which is mortgage and other loans by income, is above 30%, and this is more or less in line with these percentages that Jörg has shown you, and they were choose arbitrary, but we had consulted some of the literature and the common practices of the banking system and others in order to see, to try to set these thresholds. And the last thing, which the ratio of housing expenditure, which is rent plus utilities by the gross income, if it's above 30%, with conditions that income is below the median. So if any of these conditions are met, a person would be considered deprived in that indicator, while this indicator is initially at the household level, but we are under the assumption that if an individual is living in a household where one of these conditions is met, he or she is considered deprived. So our second dimension is wealth. And an individual would be considered deprived in if he is living in a household where the financial assets not lasting for longer than 3 months of income, the debt to income ratio is above 3, or the debt to asset ratio is above 0.8. And the third dimension is the labor market attachment. An individual will be deprived if currently not employed, low work intensity, and this could be his or her weekly hours, working hours is less than or equal 20, labor earning below 25% of the median individual labor income. And third, has fixed term contract or self-employed. So from what I've just described, this is our multidimensional economic well-being deprivation index. It has 3 dimensions: wealth, income, and the expenses, labor market attachment, and each of them has three indicators. So our index is comprised of 9 indicators. These 3 dimensions are equally weighted, and the indicators within each dimension is equally weighted as well. And we are using a threshold of 33%. The relative. Now this
you're cutting into to the discussion time, but please try to make it short, but continue and let us know what you're talking about.
Yes, sure, sorry. So this is the relative contribution of each indicator to the total index by country. To cut it short, this is very important because it tells us, as you can see, not only income alone contributes to the highest percentage of the index, but assets or wealth as well goes hand in hand, while in some countries it's even, these are the green bars are even higher for some countries, the contribution of wealth. And not to forget that employment as well, labor market attachment variables, the 3 of them constitute significantly between 20 to 30% contribution in each of these countries. So this graph is very important to us because, in a nutshell, it tells us whether what is the importance of adding these other dimensions. Had it been that the income alone constitutes 90% of the total index, we would have doubted what we are doing. But having such pictures tells us that these other dimensions are equally important. Okay, the last slide here is a headcount ratio. So these are the percentage of individual where they are deprived in at least 1/3 of the indicators. And Austria has the lowest versus Finland has the highest. And while when we calculated the index itself, the M node, by adjusting it with the intensity, The ranking did change to some extent, especially Germany now comes at last, which shows it has a more or less higher intensity. So far, I just want to point out this is work in progress. We know that there could be some other improvements we need to do on the weights, on the choice of the indicators, to back it up more with the literature, etc. But we are here to know more from you in this aspect. We have run some preliminary sensitivity analysis by adjusting the weights of the income dimension to be 40% compared to 30% the other two dimensions, and we didn't really see huge change in the results. But of course, this is still in the very beginning. Now, Piotr, would you? We can stop here with the conclusion, Piotr.
Yeah, I think
Yes,
we can
okay.
stop here. There's
conclusion?
one more. Yes, there's one more slide on linear probability model, but maybe not that important at stage.
Yeah.
And not to take too much time for the discussion, I just want to say that, you know, to summarize, we went from this one-dimensional to two-dimensional to multidimensional index or understanding of deprivation or even poverty. And this is, again, we think this is really appropriate for the developed countries with maybe some adjustments later on if we have more data on developing countries on wealth. This could be also adjusted to the developing countries. But we really think that there's a lot of research which could be done with this wealth data and going maybe in this direction or maybe changing a little bit directions, which we show you on this multidimensional index of deprivation or poverty, etc. But thank you very much for your attention, and we hope that what we presented you was useful and clear, and we are absolutely open for the questions and comments, and we would be really delighted to hear the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jacob, turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Heba, Jörg, and Piotr, for a fantastic presentation. I'll hand over directly to our discussant, Fanny. We'll give a few remarks, and then also just a reminder to the audience, both here in the room and online, if you have any questions, make yourself known, put your question to the Q&A box, or raise your hand via Zoom or physically. But first, Fanny, please, over to you.
From there?
Yeah. Great.
Hello. Hi. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Can you see me? Okay, great. Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. I was delighted to see such a rich, comprehensive analysis, and I think it was great to have kind of a new area for us, so an extension of the AF method to, you know, monetary aspects of poverty and also to developed countries. I think we do not see this very often, so it was really interesting to read your presentation. I thought it was really comprehensive, going across Europe and North America, focusing on the 14 countries and zooming in specifically on the not income and asset poor population. The presenters show that this group is usually larger than the share of the population who are income poor in these countries. And however, there were considerable differences, which I thought were quite interesting. So while income poverty, the share of income poor population ranged roughly 8 to 18% across these countries, there was a much larger variation in the share of the people who were not income poor, but asset poor. I think around 20 to 55% across the country. And it was really, there was very rich and detailed disaggregation by different economic variables. Overall, I think the presentation gave the sense that a large segment of society in these countries have a level of income that they're not poor enough to be classed as income poor, so below 50% of the median. However, they do not possess enough resources to have sufficient financial assets to cover 3 months worth of expenses. So I thought that was in general quite an interesting finding. And then there was some interesting country patterns. So I thought your analysis on the by kind of the countries had sort of a kind of a regional pattern that I think might be worth emphasizing. So it seemed that, especially across Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe, the share of among the not income but asset poor, there was a lot more kind of share of these across the distribution. So there were people, I think you mentioned, in the highest income quartile, and also people in kind of the third and fourth wealth quartile who were still asset poor. So I thought this was quite an interesting finding and something probably worth looking more into. A second kind of geographical aspect I thought that was really interesting, and kind of is the debt to income ratio and debt to asset ratio, especially in some of the richest countries such as Norway, Luxembourg, but I think also the US and Canada. You found a lot of people being over indebted among those who were asset poor. So I wondered it would be quite interesting to kind of look into this and see if there are any patterns, whether that's by the type of debt people own, whether this is due to student loans perhaps, or kind of the wages to property price ratio, or whether this is consumer debt. I think you mentioned credit card debt in the case of the US. So it will be interesting to see more analysis perhaps on this, but also on the demographic side. So who are these people who are over indebted, but also asset poor at the same time? Are they younger people in urban areas with a large student loan? Are they single households and larger families, or the elderly? I think this will be a very nice area to look into if you're still continuing this project. And then the third area I thought was really worth kind of delving more into was the slide you had on home ownership. And maybe this is just my misunderstanding, but you had a slide where you showed that even people who own their homes outright were asset poor. So I wondered if maybe you could explain a little bit more about this. Like, do you count the home in the assets? Because if someone owns it outright, I assume they would, it's 100% equity. So would that not be enough to cover the expenses, or do you not take property in the financial assets? So that's just a question to clarify. And then on the well-being index, so it was really interesting. You had the 3 dimensions and the 9 indicators. I'll have a few questions that perhaps are a little bit technical, but I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the weights that you used, whether they were equal weights across dimensions or across the indicators. And I was wondering about your income dimension. So you had 3 indicators. One was the below 50% of median equivalized household income. And then you had 2 other indicators for ratio of debt by income and ratio of housing expenditure by income. But you also included for both of those the below 50% of median condition. I wonder why, like if you can explain the reason behind it. Because my sense is that you could just include it because they're separate indicators. So if someone is deprived or someone is low income, they would already be deprived in the indicator. So you don't need to include it necessarily in the other 2 indicators in the income dimension. And then the other one, so just for presentation, I thought it would be really interesting also to see the comparison of just income poverty with the headcount ratio and the MPI that you presented. The last slide, I think, was in the end. So you presented the levels according to the Economic Wellbeing Index. So I thought it would be interesting to just put next to it the income poverty levels that you showed to us at the beginning. Just to kind of have a more comprehensive overview. And what else did I think that I have many questions? Yes, so I was wondering if you considered separating or why you didn't separate within the employment status by unemployment. So whether because I think you have a category for people who are not employed, so not. Is this including people outside of the labor market as well, or you just focusing on already people who are in the labor market? And I think you restricted it to 25 to 59 age group, if I'm correct. But I think, yeah, overall, really, really interesting, very good. I'm going to leave time for others who also have questions, but thank you very much. Very, 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 very interesting.
Thank you, Fanny, for your commentary. That was wonderful. You hit on a bunch of very useful points. And since I am over here and moderating, I can actually add a couple more before they start answering, but I wanted to express appreciation to our audience for patience. We'll take 5 extra minutes. Of course, we won't keep count as to who's here and who's not. My first comment is that this is really a top area for research. Many people are trying to look at the integration of income and wealth and how one affects the other and our perceptions of well-being. So this is really important. One thing that I'm interested in, and I think that one of our questionnaires was interested in, was how is this monthly consumption that you need to be able to cover defined? Is it a percentage of what their current consumption is, for instance? Is it a percentage of some kind of generic absolute amount of consumption? That's a big difference because in one case, it would be sort of a generic measure of vulnerability, but if it depends on the current situation of the people, would actually look a lot like the vulnerability measure that I have with Dutta and Mishra in the 2011 discussion that requires the level of where you want to be above to depend on the individual's current situation. So it could be quite nicely related to that approach to vulnerability. Okay, I think I'll let it go to now answers of questions and any other questions that pop up. I'll be happy to jump in.
Yeah, shall we collect more questions or comments first, or do you want to first have a go at answering? I'm aware of time, so I'm wondering what the best course of action is.
They had a ton of questions already. Maybe we should allow at least a little bit of a chance to get that. But then in the audience, you have a few questions, do you? In the live audience?
Yeah, we have some here.
Excellent. So first, let's answer these, and then keep it short, if you would, to 2 minutes, folks.
Yes, maybe indeed I go first. Basically, I think what might be quite interesting to clarify is the idea of the consumption, well, that we need to cover basically for the 3 months. So at this stage, indeed, we cannot link back basically to the consumption data right now. We don't really have a threshold in the micro data indeed. So we only have income and assets. So but how we have proxied that is indeed is the income basically, which around the median of the income and the median of the consumption, they rather meet at a similar level. Basically, that's what for us is the second best in that sense in data. So this is sort of our benchmark at this stage in data. But obviously, I mean that ideally that should be improved in that sense, having a more robust measure of basically actual consumption in data. Piotr, would you want to go ahead with answering the clarification of the split into financial versus non-financial? I think that would be really important as well.
Right. So actually, as I said, we use only the financial assets. We didn't use the non-financial assets. And your question, I guess, was about the regression, right? Which I show about the home ownership, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, you're saying that.
And right, exactly. So that was, the regression when we did a linear probability model, which we didn't show in this presentation due to lack of time. And indeed, it shows that if you are the owner of the home or apartment and real estate, you are more likely to be deprived in this headcount ratio of multidimensionally economically deprived people, and we believe this is due to this debt which you might have, and that's unfortunately the case. I mean, you would think that if you have home, if you're the owner with mortgage or without mortgage, owning outright, you might be better off, but maybe this is not. That's what our results are showing, not the case. But so we're still investigating this a little bit further, and hope to have better understanding of this. But that's our first impression.
Right. Any other answers coming from the group?
Yes, yes, I think there were a couple of questions about the index. I will just try to reply to what I was able to write down quickly. So the question regarding the weights, we have used equal weights across the 3 dimensions and across all the indicators within each dimension.
Yes.
So very, very standard. We have run a test like sensitivity analysis where we have given the income and expenses in dimension 40% versus 30 and 30 for the other 2 dimensions. It didn't really change the overall ranking and the picture a lot, but we have to admit that we need to work on this further. But we thought to start with the standard, let's say, equal weights, equal dimensions, equal indicators. So this is about the indicators. As for the using 50% of the median in our indicators, we have it separately as an indicator, and we have it in the other 2 indicators because during our trial and errors and working on that, it turned out that if we didn't put such a condition, we have a very high percentage of people being deprived while they are not, they shouldn't be from our empirical analysis. But we can try to run it further and maybe look more into the literature. But empirically, we thought that was more correct. Maybe Jörg later can add something in this respect. Third, thank you so much for the comment about adding the head count, the poverty head count ratio besides the index. I think that would be a very nice addition to grasp the difference instantly. As for why didn't we separate within the employment status, indeed, our flag or our deprivation is whether you are employed or the other categories who even those who are outside the labor market are considered, are taken into account. This was under the assumption, again, that this is an individual level index, and we would like to know what if you are now a spouse and you are a housewife, or and then you got separated, you lost the source of income. What is the vulnerability? That's why we included them, but we didn't do another run excluding those who are outside the labor market. But this is very welcome comment, and for sure we will try to enhance it and develop it better. So thank you so much.
Okay, Jacob.
So I just
questions.
Very small note to add to this. Indeed, only the pensions might be indeed alternative stable income. All the other incomes may not be, maybe be just temporary. Indeed, and they can disappear right away quickly. Indeed, that's without.
Okay, we have one question or maybe a few, and then I also have just some comments, if I may, and you don't need to answer those to conclude.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I just want to quickly build on Fanny's comment about the different types of debt and what that actually might mean sort of in a practical perspective. So just sort of latching on to the US side of things, because you mentioned that's a confounding case and that's where I do my work. You can imagine maybe if someone has medical debt, that might symbolize something entirely different than if someone has student debt. And so student debt, for example, that from a human development perspective, that pretty much guarantees that someone's not deprived in education. But medical debt, that actually from a more human development capability approach might indicate that they're actually in poor health. So I'm wondering, once you do get maybe this, if you can get this disaggregated data about what the debt source is there a way to sort of reckon with these differences about what different types of debt might symbolize about a household or an individual? Thanks.
Great. And well, first of all, also from me, thank you for the great discussion. And I really look forward also to seeing this project take more shape into future iterations of your analysis. For that, I just wanted to share a few observations and perhaps a few suggestions as well, which you may take away as you want or ignore if they don't seem useful. But one thing I just noticed when you presented the structure of the index, and that also builds on Fanny was already saying earlier, is that I had the impression that there was a little bit of double counting going on, not only in the income dimension, but also between the labor employment and the income dimension, because you include labor income again as an indicator in that dimension. So we possibly double or even triple count various sources of income that are once aggregated in household income and then again summarized only for the labor force, which will have effects on the results that you're observing, and you know, could make sure that this double counting is reduced as one idea going forward. Another thought I had was on, so you mentioned that the individual level identification is one of the interesting things that your index is able to offer. However, that is also only the case for the income dimension, if I saw that correctly, right? Everything else is still defined at the household level. And now your sample is reduced to the labor force, basically, which might mean that your estimates will be quite conservative and really underestimate a lot of the burden that is going on in households that are much larger, which is very often the case, those who have lower incomes and perhaps also lower wealth per capita, basically. So you could think about constructing a household level indicator that is somehow linked to your individual level labor force information on employment, also to make sure that the summary statistics you get now don't really underplay the extent of both wealth and income poverty that you have, because you only each time capture that one individual or the few individuals perhaps who are in the labor force, but not any children, elderly, other people outside of the labor force. More sensitivity robustness analysis, I think, would be another suggestion, but Heba already mentioned that was a plan. So the last idea, thought, comment I had was to maybe tweak some of the indicators as well. One is I think you have imputed rent, for example, and these kind of things as well. So if you think about looking at the relationship of household ownership and renting, for example, in relation to this, that might be one variable that could help you to improve that picture. And then the other one is, I assume you haven't pooled everything, but done it by country. So if you want to achieve something that's truly comparable, going away from these implicit inequality measures, which are the relative income statistics, and towards an absolute threshold might be something you would want to consider maybe as a variation or as an alternative to what you've done so far. I'm, of course, fully aware that, especially in the European Union, this median income qualification at 60% is the standard. And so you might be speaking to that literature. But just in terms of the international comparability and also comparisons over time, the absolute might have advantages. So it might be good to consider that. Great. So those are my 2 cents. Thank you all so much. James, anything else from you, or shall we give?
Well, yes, I do have a couple things, and then I'll turn it over to you to finish it up locally, if that's all right. First, I wanted to tell you to have a look at the kind of quality of education, quality of employment literature by Kirsten Senbruch, who's here, or look at what we have online at the Inter-American Development Bank with the Better Jobs Index. It's a great place to have a quick sense of what quality can impart and to link to those things, because then when you are putting in quality of employment, it really anchors it down quite nicely. I do think that things like capital income versus the wealth, there's some double counting there. That is not altogether bad, but I mean, if someone has to spend off their wealth to survive a situation, they may very well lose the capital income that we covered in the income part as a result of the lowering wealth. So there's some really interesting interaction effects that have to be dealt with there. I'm not entirely opposed to double counting in all cases, so long as when you double count, you realize you're getting double importance for something. If it is doubly important, then that's fine. If it isn't, then you'll be stuck with it. So that's what I would encourage you to do. Finally, the other thing is that household debt is included by lots of folks. It's also excluded by lots of folks. Sometimes it's primary household ownership and debt, and that's excluded or included. So there are some issues that can be discussed in that. I think you are having some issues when you own a big house. You could definitely sell it if you had a medical emergency. And that is part of the game plan of people's with big houses that they could sell on the marketplace. Sure, it's not liquid, but it's there. So anyway, that's my commentary. Great presentation, wonderful work. Look forward to the future. Jacob?
Yeah, I think with that, we will thank our speakers and our discussant with a round of applause virtually and here in the room. And thank you, James, for fantastic sharing, as always. We say goodbye from Oxford and hope to see you all again next week for our final presentation in this series.